Hi, I'd like to talk to you today about the principles of writing a good paper. Not necessarily the details, but the principles. Maybe the secrets of how to write a good paper. Now, I mostly do research papers, and in your classes, you'll have different kinds of papers. But I think this is an approach to writing a paper that can make you successful, maybe in any class and maybe in life in general. It's important, and I want my students to be persuasive individuals who can argue for a point, express reasons why, and be convincing. I have about 20 years of teaching experience. I've graded thousands of papers. I've also done my own research and published the results. So this little talk is drawn from that experience. Again, it's the principles of how to write a good paper, not necessarily the details. While I think my principles work most of the time everywhere, you should always ask individual professors what they want from you. And even in my classes, sometimes what I require in papers is a little bit different. And also they're principles. And so they're high goals and values that we're all seeking to attain. And I understand that you're at a beginning level, and my aim is to help you learn in small steps how to write a good paper. So let's get started. First of all, at university, we'll talk about the topic and organization. You need to write an analysis paper, not a high school report. So it's something new from high school. It's not just where you stand up and list a bunch of facts that happened. It has to be a paper of analysis, not just a simple report of what you think happened, the facts. So how do you do that? And so I want to give you some good tips on how to produce a paper that is an analysis that I think will work for you. I think the key of writing a good paper, particularly a research paper, although I think it applies to pretty much all writing, is to ask a good question or try to solve a problem maybe. But let's stick with the idea of the question. Ask a good question. I think that's where it all begins. Now, what is a good question? This is a question that there's two components to it, I think. It's a question for which there is no simple answer, but which is important for as many people as possible. So let's take the first part. It has to be a question for which there is no simple answer. For example, a really bad research question is, when was Abraham Lincoln born? Well, it takes me about 10 seconds to find out he was born February 12th, 1809, and so there's no paper to write there. Maybe if it becomes controversial, you could write a paper about that if it's controversial among professional historians, but generally not. It's a complicated question for which there is no simple answer, and there's a certain amount of humility based into that, in that. It's a complicated question that nobody will ever really find the answer to, and that's why it's worth discussing. A better question is something like, what causes crime? Now that's a good question. It's a good research question. It's not a question for a paper that you can write in one semester. It's more like a lifelong question that you'll chew on for your whole life, and you might get an academic career out of it in a few books. You probably have to narrow it down. So what causes crime? Maybe you could narrow it to, does poverty cause crime? Even that is pretty broad. And so maybe did poverty cause crime in New York City between 1960 and 1980? And even that's going to be problematic and probably needs to be narrowed, but I think you get the idea. That's much better than something like, when did Pearl Harbor happen? Or when was Abraham Lincoln born? These are difficult questions. I find definitions of terms very good. What is democracy? So sometimes people simplistically think that you can just look in a dictionary and get the answer to what is democracy, but historians know that people in different places and different times use that word to mean pretty different things. It's a complicated, ongoing discussion that will not be solved simplistically with a one-sentence answer. There's always going to be kind of an argument about it. Is violence natural or unnatural for humans? Again, it needs to be narrowed, but these are good questions because they give you something to work on your whole life. Now you have to make it specific, but they're good questions and there's no simple answer. Now the second part of this, the question is also, it should be as important for as many people as possible. This is really, really hard, and I don't expect you to master this. Scholars spend their lives trying to do this. How can you write a paper that deals with a question that is universal in its significance? All people everywhere in all times will read this paper and struggle with your question and think that's a good question for me. Over time and geography and generations, people don't think of history or some of the other disciplines as art, but this is where they turn into art. Not many people can achieve this. Not many people can do this, partly because it's contrary to the first part. When you ask a difficult question to which there is no simple answer, as you dive into that question, you become an expert, and experts deal with parochial details, and those kind of details and facts and data are boring for most people and simply not relevant to most people. So it's art, really. How can you take those boring details that you've mastered as an expert and explain to everybody in the world why they're important? That's quite an achievement. Not many people can do it. Some great historians, maybe Eric Hobsbawm, achieved this. I think Timothy Snyder is a historian who addresses problems of universal significance, whose books will be read for a long time. And I want to encourage you too. Some of you have fascinating issues. You have a kind of curiosity about the world. And so I just want to say, students do write compelling papers that occasionally that I sit down and I read the paper and I think, wow, that's important. That's good. I understand immediately why this is an important topic. But I also want you to understand that Rome wasn't built in a day. And this is a very, very difficult thing to do. And this is why I'm talking about principles. But it is something to aspire to. And if you don't let yourself off easy and you try, every time you try this, every time you write a paper, you'll get better at it. And in the end, it'll leave you a stronger person, intellectually, maybe personally as well. In my classes, I'll tell you this, it's very difficult to formulate a good question. I've been doing this for years. I'm a professional historian. So in my classes, I often give you questions to grapple with throughout the semester. I feel that it's my job to walk you through this process in little parts. And so that's what a lot of my papers are about. Because the things that I'm telling you in this lecture are very, very hard to do. And so you have to start with little steps. Often I give you in your syllabus a question or a series of questions to try to solve throughout the semester. Now, so you have a question, right? It's a question for which there's no simple answer. And so there has to be some discussion about it and disagreement. And it's important for as many people as possible. That's hard to do. And now you want to try to provide some kind of answer. You can't just make it up. This is the scholarship part. You have to have some kind of data. So you're going to look at you're going to try to answer your question based on some kind of data. Now, different disciplines have different kinds of data. In In the historical discipline, it almost always means written sources. Maybe there's some exceptions to that, but it's usually written sources. And so there's two kinds for historians in history class. There's a lot of complexities in this, but I'm not going to deal with all of those. I just want to say the gold standard for historians are primary sources. Usually they're written and they're primary sources. These are sources written in or during the period that you're studying. So if you're studying World War I, they are sources that are written between 1914 and 1918. It's a little more complex than that, but that's, for our purposes, that's enough. They're the historical sources written in the period that you're studying. That's the ultimate for historians. All good questions in the historical discipline ultimately must be answered in the primary sources. Not every class that you take with me will require you to analyze primary sources, just so you know that. I still think my principles for writing a paper apply. Next are secondary sources. So these are basically articles and books by historians, and secondary sources are professional historians, their analysis of the primary sources. So it's professional historians, and secondary sources are what they say about the primary sources. They're very important. Some of them are very good. They're an entranceway to the primary sources. They are not where you ultimately can answer questions. They're what other people say about the sources, and therefore they're secondhand. What other people say about the primary sources. Ultimately, if you're a good historian, ultimately you need to settle questions in the primary sources. Now, every discipline, whatever class you're taking, has some kind of data. And so these are the ones that you'll deal with in history. But the point is, to get back to the main flow of the lecture here, you have to ask a good question, and then you don't just make up an answer like a fiction writer. You try to find some kind of answer in the data, and that means in history, it means the sources. I want to inject something here quickly before I move on to the next point about the sources. This also implies a certain level of humility. You will never see all the sources. You will never see all the data. And that's going to be important in part 2 of this talk as well. So keep that in mind. You can never look at all the sources. You can't live long enough to read them all. Both secondary and especially primary. You can't understand them all. There's always a gap between you and the source. There's something you don't understand. There's something missing. Other people read the same source and come up with different conclusions. I just want you to understand that. But let's walk through this again. Ask a good question and then figure out which sources in other disciplines, which data, but in history, which sources you're going to analyze in order to try to come up with a question. And now we come to the hard part. Now, it's not really that hard. It is in some ways, but in other ways it's not. That's your hypothesis or your thesis statement and the organization. So your hypothesis is, let's walk through it again. You ask a question, and then you take that question to the sources, and then based on what you studied, your sources, not other things, not guesses, not rumors, not what other people think, but based strictly on the sources that you studied, what answer did you come up with to your question? What answer did you find in those sources? Tell us what your answer is to your question. That's your hypothesis. Tell us what you found. Now, this is hard in some ways. In the way I'm describing it, it's not really, but it is hard. One of the things that makes it hard is this. I used to teach composition classes. So one of the things we do in composition classes is third or fourth week, you have to come up with a thesis statement. So how do you do that? That's the process that I just described to you. You have to ask a question, study the sources, and that requires a couple weeks at least in the semester, maybe years if you're writing a book. And then based on what you studied, then you finally have a thesis, right? And so how do you do that the second week in the semester before you've even looked at the sources? It's really hard to do. And so that makes it difficult for students. And in some ways, it's the wrong way to do things. Composition classes are designed to teach you this process in a different way. And so I understand why it's like that, but it's really hard to do. So here's the way I deal with that. So it's kind of like, when do you have a thesis statement? Is it in the third week of the semester or in the 10th week of the semester? It shouldn't be in the 15th because you need like a lot of time to write the paper. But when do you have a thesis statement? And so the answer is kind of both. And here's the way I deal with this. In order to do research, you always need kind of like a preliminary thesis. So in some ways, this is easy. Like when you look at the world, you see all kinds of data, and you almost without thinking. In fact, I think I read an article on this. I think there's actually a section of the brain that does this. You make sense of it. Like it's not just chaos to you. Everything you see around you, you have some explanation for. And so when you're beginning a research project, you have a guess. You have a guess what causes crime, or poverty causes crime, or poverty does not cause crime, right? You have a guess. And that's okay because your brain works like that. But here's the way here, but the scientific endeavor challenges us to investigate that preliminary guess again in the data. And here's why, because most of those guesses about the world are wrong. The whole scientific endeavor is not just to accept your superficial analysis of everything. It's to look deeper and to question that superficial analysis. So I hope I haven't confused you, but sure, like in week 3 of the semester, you have a guess about what you're going to find in the sources. And that's, your teacher, it's not like that in my classes, but in composition classes, your professor wants you to put that in a statement, a thesis statement, and you can do that. But the real thesis, the real hypothesis of your paper is going to come after you look at the sources a little bit, after the data. And that's okay, you can change. So anyway, that's the hypothesis. Just to let me review again, ask a good question, look for the answer in a particular set of sources that's finite and limited, by the way. And then based on what you've studied, propose a hypothetical answer to your difficult question. So in a way it's hard, and in another way it's easy. I approached my sources with a question, and over a period of a few weeks or a few months or a few years, I convinced myself of an answer. And now I just have to explain to my readers how I got there. That's all it is. That's your hypothesis. Now, the best thing is, let's focus on that answer for a minute. I convinced myself of an answer to my question. I need to narrow that down to one sentence, and that's the thesis statement. In the final paper that you turn in, there should be a clearly stated thesis statement. This is the answer that I convinced myself of, and it should be featured prominently in the beginning of the paper. First paragraph usually works well in a short paper. Somewhere in there, introduce the thesis statement. So I studied the sources. I convinced myself. I asked a question of the sources. I convinced myself of an answer. And that's my thesis statement expressed in one sentence. And now the organization is so simple. I mean, it's hard work, but it's simple because here's my thesis statement. So this is what I believe to be true based on what I studied. And so let me tell you why. So the organization is easy. Here's 3, 4, 5, 6 points. These are the reasons why I came to this thesis statement, why I proposed this thesis statement. Again, it's hard. Like I said, there's an art to it, but it's also easy in a way. And in some ways, I find writing papers and the broader process of research, I find it thrilling. It's kind of a personal quest. There's something deeply honest about it. And it's even fun. And I would encourage you to take it seriously because it's better for you that way. Maybe you've noticed it's kind of like an exercise. It's kind of like an exercise that will strengthen you and sharpen you mentally and make you strong. And I hope you get it. It's something that you can use in more than just history classes. The ability to look, it's in a way, it's kind of like problem solving. You can use it whatever you do. And that's why I talk about the principles of writing a good paper. Anyway, there's another thing to remember here. That word hypothesis, you'll notice the word hypothetical in there. And so you all know what hypothetical means. That's not quite the same as true. It's kind of imagined in a way. And I think people forget this, students forget this. So all you're doing is telling me the reasons you came to the answer you came to. You're not proving anything. It's not like you're right and everybody else is wrong. You're just telling me what you think is the most credible answer to your question based on the sources. You're allowed to be wrong. What you're going for, though, in your paper and the organization of your paper is credibility. One of my professors once said, think of yourself as a lawyer. You're never probably going to absolutely prove anything. What you're looking for, this is a great phrase they use in law, is preponderance of evidence. So I know that I'm not 100% right, but I'm really going to argue for my answer. Let me bury you in an avalanche of evidence and be credible and convincing. And so I think it's really useful to keep that in mind. It's not that you're going for absolute truth. It's not like you're proving something and nobody can ever question it. You're making a rhetorical argument. And you're trying to show that it's the best answer. Not the perfect answer, but the best answer, the most credible answer. So things get really important here. And maybe you've sensed already this little talk is about more than just how to write a paper. It's very, very important to me. In my mind, it's related to to Western civilization and the maintenance of a free society, free and open society. So when you're doing your research, and I can tell you this from personal experience, when you're buried in the data looking for answers to your question, you start to build up an explanation, your answer. You start to build up a hypothesis. And you go through the evidence and you find all these documents and they support your hypothesis, they support your hypothesis, but you always run into some strange letter, correspondence, or document, and it doesn't fit. It doesn't fit your hypothesis. It's contrary evidence. Sometimes it's called errant data. This is true in the sciences as well. A lot of people don't know it, but in good research, it's always true because anything can happen, right? You don't know the truth, you're looking for it, and so you have to accept that it could be literally anything. And so things pop up that don't fit your little story. And that happens to me as a historian, and I'm sure if historians are honest, it happens to all of them. Never do you go to the archive and everything confirms your hypothesis or your thesis. There's contrary evidence. And so how you deal with that is the mark of who you are as a scholar, and I would also say your integrity as a person. So what do you do with it? Do you hide it? Do you create elaborate and convoluted logical explanations to dismiss it, or it's also hiding it in words. Like some things are disharmonious, and scholars will go to great ridiculous lengths to make them harmonious. So this is really important. There's always contrary evidence. It will always be there. So here's how I try to handle it. And it's a difficult problem. I usually step back and I say, well, I studied this data. I convinced myself of this answer. But there are these things here that contradict my explanation. But for some reason, I went with this evidence and not so much this evidence. So my obligation is to explain that to you. What is it that made me choose this over this? And I think that's the best way to handle contrary evidence. Again, for a lot of you in your papers, it's not going to be that complicated, but I would, again, argue that this is not just about writing a paper, but not a bad way to conduct your life. And the thing about contrary evidence, too, I need to say this, and this is where things, I think, get really important. This is why we need a free and open society where we can debate and discuss and disagree openly, where we can have differences of opinion and dialogue and criticism. And here's the reason why, because when you're building your hypothesis, you're so wrapped up in your credibility, right? Like arguing your case that you miss, we all miss the things that don't fit. Other people see those. Other people have different backgrounds, different experience, and they might see that weird piece of contradictory evidence that doesn't fit in my little story, and they might know exactly what that means because they're coming from a whole different place than me. And so we need to have that possibility where we can publicly put forward a hypothesis. It's not the truth. It's not the end. It's the best answer I can give. And then other people can critique it and challenge it. And that's important. We need that. And it needs to, a lot of times it's helpful to me. Sometimes it's critical. We need that criticism. It's essential. And that's why you shouldn't be defensive when I write comments on your paper or when other people comment on it, because that, instead of being defensive, you have to take that as, and this is how I, when peers read my work, the initial reaction is, oh, they're stupid. But I have to sit back and think, well, they saw something there that I didn't see. And so this is where I believe that, especially in the academic world, a free society, the freedom to really hear all points of view is crucial. There are examples in history of societies that have gone the other way. You could have a panel of experts who just decide what's true. In the Middle Ages, the Sorbonne and the theological faculty at the Sorbonne in Paris, and they decide ultimately because they're theologians with doctorates in theology, and they decide what's true and what's not, and nobody can criticize them. They're the ultimate arbiter of truth. Or in the communist countries in Eastern Europe, you have to go pass a committee, and they decide whose hypotheses are valid and whose aren't. That's a dangerous way to go. This idea that truth can be reduced to a panel of experts who know, and nobody can challenge them. And here's why that's dangerous. Because if those people are unchallenged and they get to decide what's true and what's not, what they will do is, with the contrary evidence that always exists because life is messy, they will dismiss it, they will forbid it, so that everything that doesn't fit their picture of the universe will be censored and forbidden so that you can't see it, so that their little world makes sense. In history, as a historian, I would say there are cases where people have gone to ridiculous lengths to make their little hypothesis of the world perfectly harmonious, to the point of killing people to get rid of them, just to make their little view of the world make sense. So you see how important this got very quickly, and why this is so important to me. So anyway, getting back to your paper, just to sort of walk you through it again, how to write a good paper and principles of writing a good paper. Notice that in detail, there's different kinds of paper, but ask a good question for which there is no simple answer, but which is of universal importance. Choose a certain set of data that is limited and finite. In the data, you look for your answer. Based on the data, you convince yourself of an answer. That's your proposed answer. It's your hypothesis reduced to one sentence, a thesis statement. Your entire paper is organized around explaining why you came to that conclusion. What evidence in the sources led you to that conclusion? I believe that if you master this technique, it will make you not only good at writing papers, but good at life, at least in a professional sense. It's in some way hard. In other ways, the method that I'm explaining to you is easy. It takes a lot of curiosity and desire to find answers. But it's also an exercise that you can do over and over and over again that will make you intellectually strong and able to solve problems and explain to people how you got to the solution that you got to. That's the end of part 1. Join me for part 2. Goodbye.